Good day. 45 years ago, on Black Wednesday in October 1977, the apartheid government banned 3 newspapers and arrested a number of journalists. Recording this in a recent article in the Daily Maverick, Professor Glenda of the Media Studies Department at Wits University writes that although the media now has much greater freedom in our country, the attacks on journalists are real and serious. Glenda, thank you very much for joining us. Can we start by looking at what some of these attacks are these days?
Yes, hello, Mike. Thanks for having me. The attacks are so varied, but I'll run through them. One of the main ones is not an obvious one on media freedom, but it's actually very relevant, and that is the fact that newsrooms have been halved from about a decade ago. So if, for instance, we had 10,000 journalists a decade ago, we have about 5,000 now, which means there's a lot of pressure in newsrooms to compete with social media and a lack of skills, because a lot of senior journalists have been culled or axed or retrenched. And subs desks in particular, they're just decimated. There are very few subs to look at copy. And this also has an effect on plurality and diversity of news. So that's a big threat. It's a commercial threat. It's what media companies are not doing, and they're under pressure from digitization and social media. So that's, a big thing. And then, of course, the other threats are journalists going to court to report on things and getting thrown out there. It's almost like magistrates don't know the role of the media in journalism. And then we've had community members also literally stoning journalists, also not understanding how the media could help their plight. We've had instances of political parties and politicians trolling, especially of women journalists. It's called cyber misogyny. And that's a huge threat. It's almost like there's this poisonous attack and toxicity that's taking place on social media. And a lot of it is aimed at journalists. It's like a way to make them vulnerable, to shut them up, to intimidate and bully. So those are some of the things. What are the other things? Community harassment, cyberbullying and misogyny. And then we've got some laws pending, I might add. Well, one is a media appeals tribunal, which is merely a resolution of the ANC's, but it's there like hanging as a sword over, journalism's neck. And that would be a post-censorship system where if you wrote something, they could say, Glenda Daniels, not on. We had to take you to Parliament and rap you over the knuckles there. So that's not good at all. And then the Protection of State Information Bill, which is just a bill. It hasn't been passed into act. That's been referred by the President, Cyril Ramaphosa, to his constitutional lawyers. It's unconstitutional because it favors the national interest, which could mean anything, as opposed to the public interest, which would protect journalists.
Yeah. Okay, it's quite a list. One of the most high profile of these attacks, if you like, at the moment is what's happening to the legal journalist Karen Maughan of News 24. I think everyone knows that Jacob Zuma at the moment is attempting to launch a private prosecution against her. And that's garnered a lot of headlines and a lot of concern. But to what extent is that actually, do you think, a serious attack on journalistic freedom, as opposed to just another one in the long line of diversions and delaying tactics that we've come to expect from Mr. Zuma and his legal team?
So, Mike, it's both. Both of those are correct. And it's a very good question to ask because, of course, us as media freedom activists and academics and journalists and media, we look at it from one angle, which is this is an attack on media freedom, which it is. But it's also part of the former president's general strategy and tactics of delaying, obfuscation, putting in another thing in place. But, he's using this also as a threat to are the journalists. The reality in this country is that investigative journalism has done a fantastic job. So that has posed a threat, whether it was in Gate or with state capture, it does pose a threat to the crooks. Journalism does pose a threat to the crooks. So in as much as it's part of his Stalingrad strategy, it's also part of the fact that he seems to hate journalists who've done this, in particular, who've exposed him.
Yeah. Doesn't seem like he's going to get very far with this particular prosecution, but I suppose time will tell.
I don't think so. I think the courts will act according to the Constitution. I hope so. I'm sure it will. Yeah.
You've mentioned this question of journalists coming under attack in communities that are out there doing their job and filming, might be demonstrations or whatever's going on, and then they are somehow almost seen to be on the wrong side of things. What's going on here? Are people misunderstanding the role of the media? Is there a lack of trust? What's behind this?
I think there is a trust issue, because I think, it's not one factor that's causing this. It's a myriad of factors. But one of the things would be related to, they actually don't want to be seen on camera doing illegal things, such as burning tires. That's the obvious one. And the other thing is a criminal thing. So, it's literally wanting to steal cameras and cell phones of journalists, and they see journalists as rich and privileged.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is there's also a feeling in communities that journalists are not on the ground and not part of communities. They serve the elite. So that's very much, it's not widespread, but it's there. It's there. You're not part of us. You're not actually helping us. And yet, in fact, when journalists do go out to communities, they are trying to find out what's happening, but often they are not. Often they are saying, you'll be prevented from driving on this road because there's a protest here. So they're coming at it from the angle of the motorist and inconvenience to society.
Yeah.
So all that kind of thing does have an impact. Activists on the ground will say, did you hear that report about how journalists reported on that? Watch out for that highway. Watch out for that. So are they actually speaking in people's languages? Are they actually asking people what are the issues? What's going on here? Or are they just filming fire and, because it's sensational, and that's journalism all over the world as well. You can't help it. If there's a fire and there's burning and stoning and shooting and tear gas, that's what you're trained as a journalist to do. You go and cover it.
Yeah, understandable. You also mentioned journalists being kicked out of courts, particularly a magistrate's court. I take it these are people that are there just doing ordinary reporting, and magistrates not understanding the right of the media to be there. That's quite disturbing.
It's very disturbing. I mean, often magistrates say that, there can't be journalists in this court, and then you have to do an interdict overnight to say, this is actually in the public interest. This is a big fish in state capture we want to hear, or this is Zandile Gumede in the Durban, ex-Durban mayor, and we need to be there and we need to hear. And it's only through that action of an interdict that suddenly they say, okay, you're now allowed to go in, and then the magistrates allow them in. And then in other cases, sometimes journalists are talking in court, and for very spurious reasons, you get chucked out. It's like they're just not popular. You're the enemy wherever you go. It's often the case, and that's happening more and more. It seems like a small example, but we're just getting more and more instances of it. You in Parliament in Cape Town, and you're reporting, and police outside don't know that you're actually allowed to be there.
Yeah.
And they're ripping off film from photographers' cameras. Actually, you're not supposed to do that. They're on the wrong side of the law. So, so there are all these various instances which then seem to add up to there's a lot of vigilance. We have a lot of media freedom in this country compared to, in fact, we're higher on the press freedom index than the USA and the UK.
Okay.
And we're not as high as Finland, Sweden, Denmark, etc. But we're quite high up there in the world for press freedom. In other words, we're not getting, nobody's going to jail for reporting. Well, we've got the Karen Warren instance of the attempted prosecution. So even though we've got this fantastic journalist freedom, there are always these things to watch out for, because it impinges on the public's right to know.
Right. Let's move on to the SABC. It's the country's biggest media outlet. It's supposed to be public broadcaster and not the state broadcaster. Can you tell us briefly what exactly is the difference between a public broadcaster and a state broadcaster?
Okay, so what happens if the ANC conflates itself as the state? The ANC is a governing party, and it makes this collapse or illusion that state and government are one, but they're not. The state's always going to be there. So likewise, that illusion happens. Likewise, it happens with the ANC and the state and the government, as though it is owned by the powers that be. Whereas if it's a public broadcaster, public means owned by the citizenry. It's supposed to be there to serve the people. The people meaning you and me and everybody else, not it's not a police force that would be the state. And it's not the ANC. The ANC can't think it owns the SABC, often thinks it does. So that's the kind of separation that needs to happen in the minds of the people who govern the country.
Okay. During the state capture years, the SABC was quite obviously captured. And even before that, I think it was quite widely seen as unduly favoring the governing party, never mind before 1994. We're talking in the democratic era. What's your assessment of it now, a few years after supposedly state capture started fading away? Is the SABC making progress towards becoming a true public broadcaster?
At the present moment, as we stand, there's no SABC board, by the way, so that's quite hectic.
Yeah.
I think it's always going to be this contested terrain of push and pull. And in the last few years, I think SABC journalists have done actually quite well to push against the subjection that they've experienced from the ANC. Unfortunately, the CEO, the last editor-in-chief, the last Magubeni, Patiswa Magubeni, she was fired on spurious reasons. They've got somebody else in now as the editor-in-chief, and let's see how that goes. So there's always going to be the governing party coming in to think, well, it's now election time, you need to interview me. Well, life doesn't work like that, and media doesn't work like that, and shouldn't work like that, because they don't own the SABC. So it just goes up and down the whole time, and we just have to watch how it goes. At the moment, if I tune into an SABC station, I actually don't think it's that bad. If I tune into SAFM, it's actually, I get interviewed on SAFM all the time. I can say whatever I like,
Yeah.
So it's actually not that bad. But let's see what happens as we get closer to the election in 2024, if they're going to start putting the pressure again on the SABC.
And this lack of a board at the moment, who's responsible? Is it a ministerial thing, or is it Parliament that appoints the board?
It's a combination of both. It's they put out names, they call for nominations. There's a whole new list of names at the moment, and so it's actually where the old board it's not like something funny going on, because the old board's term actually ended on the 16th of October, but they haven't finalized the new board.
Okay, so it's more like an inefficiency than anything else.
Yeah, it's more like, hurry up now
Yeah.
rather than something bad.
Okay.
Something sinister. That was the word I was looking for.
Yeah. Talking about something sinister, it just emerged a week or two ago that independent media has launched a campaign that they're calling Operation Klanza, which means cleanse, I believe, and it's aimed at ensuring that Cyril Ramaphosa is not re-elected as ANC president in December. You described this on News 24 as unethical and scurrilous. Now, how does such a campaign differ from what we are used to seeing, for example, in the US and the UK and so on, where newspapers and other media routinely take sides and back certain candidates and oppose other candidates? What's the difference here?
The difference is this is not the tradition of South African journalism because we have a press code. And the problem here is that independent newspaper pulled out of being part of the press code. So we are governed, it's a self-regulation, co-regulation system by the Press Council of South Africa. And when it pulls out, it can do what it likes. It's unaccountable. So yes, we do, just because Fox News can do a pro-Trump thing and the UK newspapers have done this forever. The Guardian has supported Labour, and I forget the name now, Daily Mirror, whatever, supporting Conservatives. That has been their trend, and that's how they do it. It's normal there. But just because it's normal elsewhere in the world, it doesn't mean that we should all support this move by independent newspapers, because in fact it's joining in the divisiveness and the factionalism that's going on in the country, which is exactly why we are where we are today. It's not that I support Cyril Ramaphosa and I don't support Jacob Zuma or anything like that. It just seems like a little operation to support the party or the faction that would come in so that independent newspapers doesn't have to pay the Public Investment Corporation the money it owes it. So that's scurrilous as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I suppose it also in a way just adds to the sort of politicization of the media.
Yes.
As you say, our tradition, I suppose, again, since 1994, because certain newspapers before 94 made it their business to support opposition politics, at least. And of course, the National Party had its own stable of tame newspapers. But since 94, we've come to expect a certain even-handedness and aloofness, in a sense, from party politics in our media. And this threatens
Absolutely.
to
So
undermine that.
it's not, sorry.
I say this
Sorry?
threatens to undermine that even-handedness.
Yes. So, we don't talk about objectivity in journalism anymore. We talk about being fair and balanced, and that's what's in the press code. So if you're going whole hog for Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, and you are doing this little covert operation in your newsroom, I think that's rather pathetic, actually. Because how do you report fairly and in a balanced way so that the public can trust you?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's it's just not on in my book in the way I understand what journalism is supposed to be.
Yeah. Okay, just to begin summing up, you've mentioned that by international standards, we enjoy quite a high degree of media freedom, ranked higher than the US and the UK, which is interesting. But are there any other key, changes, improvements that you'd like to see, whether we're talking, strictly legal matters, legislation, or attitudinal questions that would give us greater media freedom? What would make you feel more comfortable when you look at the media landscape?
I think what would make me feel more comfortable is if media companies trained journalists, invested in training journalists so that there's more skill in the newsroom, less juniorized newsroom, or you have both, older people mentoring the younger people, and not just retrench people and create redundancies. I'd feel a lot more comfortable if I saw that happening. And I would feel a lot more comfortable if the SABC was left to do journalism and there wasn't always this political pressure upon them. And you have SABC board members who are fair and not there to support their political masters. That would be fantastic. If something like the Karen Moore thing didn't happen, I'd feel more comfortable. But so there are all these things that I think would, we actually do have a robust democracy in South Africa, but it's always so fragile. And one of the reasons why we have a robust democracy is because journalism is there, independent journalism is there, and independent judiciary is there. And we need every newsroom to have an investigative unit. And the funding of journalism has become a huge issue now, media sustainability and funding. So all those kinds of issues, if they can't be tackled overnight, they need like thought leadership and ways in which we can just reimagine how this can happen. Support from the public is super important.
Mm. And I would imagine also from organized civil society, I think there is a pretty good relationship between the various human rights, social justice organizations, etc., and at least the truly independent media, the investigative journalists. They seem to have quite a good symbiotic relationship.
By and large, I think a lot of civil society organizations view the media as bourgeois, elite, etc. So there's a bit of tension there too. But by and large, there's an understanding of what media's role does, what it's supposed to do, it's normative, and what it largely does. So yes, I think the civil society element and the fact that we have, unlike in the rest of Africa, we have stronger civil society organizations in South Africa, louder, noisier, more robust, NGOs and media freedom organizations as well. That gives me hope, I suppose.
Great, thank you. My guest today has been Professor Glenda Daniels, who's the head of the Department of Media Studies at Wits University. Glenda, thank you very much for giving us some of your time today.
Thank you, Mike. It was nice to chat to you. Nice to have this interview. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.